Hello, I'm Richard with EV4U, and in this video we're going to continue in our series on a beginner's guide to DIY off-grid power. If you remember our last episode, we kind of went over the main outline. We're going to talk about what your power needs were, how many batteries you're going to need to meet those power needs, and how much solar you're going to need to recharge those batteries, and what you need to know to calculate all of that. We're going to use some real-world examples, and we're going to answer your questions. And then we went on to discuss the different requirements as far as your loads go, whether it be lights, fans, refrigerators, air conditioning, whatever. We talked about how to figure what that load was going to be, and we figured up a total for a day's usage. Okay, so remember it was the power requirement times the time. So if you had a certain power requirement and you needed that for an hour, you multiplied that times 1, and that was how many watt hours per day you needed that. And if you used it 4 hours, you take that power requirement times 4, and that would be how many watt hours per day you needed. So in the example that I used in that video, we saw that it was right at 5,000 watt hours per day in that example. So we'll refer back to that later on in this video. But in this video, we're going to talk about, what your power supply needs to look like to provide X amount of power for X amount of time. Because you really don't want power, meet those power requirements just for one day. Because if you don't have the ability to recharge it in real time, then you're going to be in trouble. So you had a day's worth of power and it's overcast, so forth, and you don't recharge it in real time. Day 2, you're in the dark and cold or whatever. So you typically want to have so many days worth of the power storage to get you through whatever. And the very least you'd want, say, 3 days. The system I have in my trailer is 7 days. We've got enough battery storage to go for 7 days. And then we can actually recharge that 7-day supply in one good day of sunshine. But we'll talk about that later when we start talking about solar and so forth. So today we're going to be talking basically about batteries, because that's how we're going to get that energy storage. Is going to be stored in batteries. And so we're going to talk about types of batteries. We're going to talk about pros and cons of the different types. We're going to talk about examples of voltages, system voltages, and the most common are 12, 24, and 48. And we'll talk about the pros and cons there. And so let's get started. So when it comes to lead acid, that's what historically has been under the hood of your car, used as a starting battery. And I won't get into the different types of batteries, not different chemistries. That's what we're going to be talking about, types here, chemistries. But there's different types of batteries, starting batteries, RV batteries, deep cycle batteries, RV marine, deep cycle, which is a kind of a hybrid. They got storage batteries, they got traction batteries. We're not going to talk about that because we're only interested in one type basically, and that's a storage battery. And so you can use lead acid, and lead acid comes in different forms. It comes in what they call a flooded cell, a flooded battery, and that's the ones where you can remove the covers on the cells and you put electrolyte, distilled water in there to keep the electrolyte level over the tops of the cells. That's one type. You've got sealed So it's the same chemistry. It's still lead acid chemistry, but it's sealed so that you don't have to add any electrolyte and everything. The downside is if you overcharge it and it gases, you shorten the life of the battery. That's also true for the AGM and the gel. Now the difference between the AGM and the gel from the sealed and the flooded is the internal resistance. So AGM and gel cells have lower internal resistance, which means they have a much slower self-discharge rate. And so if you leave a flooded or any of these on the shelf, they're going to self-discharge. You come back in a year and these batteries are going to have discharge during that time. But the flooded and the sealed are going to do it at a faster rate than the AGM and gel. And because of that lower internal resistance, they give up their charge quicker. So they have a higher discharge rate. But they have lower life cycles than the flooded. And life cycle's importance, a life cycle is a charge and discharge routine. And so life cycles is the number of times that you can charge and discharge that battery. And so you want a battery with higher life cycles, so it's going to last longer. Of course, the greater the number of life cycles, the greater the cost. Now, the other type common used today is lithium iron phosphate. Now, people will use the term lithium ion. That's a generic term. There's lots of different lithium chemistries. The safest and best chemistry to use in your DIY off-grid power situation is lithium iron phosphate. It also has the voltage range that mimics closer to lead acid than any other lithium chemistry. And it's by far the most popular. Like I said, big thing is it's safe. So, pros and cons between the two. Well, the price of lithium is coming down. Historically, it was the cost differential was the big thing. And you had to look beyond that to really, sift through which was better. Lithium iron phosphate is hands down, if you get rid of any biases and you just look at the math, there's just no way the two compare. And we did a video years ago that compares the two in a cost sense back in the day when lithium was expensive. And it was still far cheaper. And like I said, been doing this a long time. 16 years in the conversion business of converting gasoline cars to electric using lithium iron phosphate cells. So I know a little bit about it. When we first started, we used lead acid, so not unfamiliar there either. So, difference is the size. For any given capacity, lead acid is going to be larger. It's going to weigh, substantially more. It's going to have 1/10 of the life cycles. And the depth of discharge. You can discharge lead acid to 50% state of charge, or depth of discharge. Two ways to look at that. But it's only 50% of that capacity is usable. So if you have a 100 amp hour lead acid battery, only 50 amp hours is usable. Whereas with LiPo4, smaller, lighter, like I said, 10 times the life cycles. And depending on the packaging, lithium iron phosphate cells by themselves, without being packaged with an internal BMS that's going to affect things. They're, by the chemistry, they're good for 80% depth of discharge. But what happens, a lot of these companies, SOC, Battleborn, and on, there's a lot of them out there today. They'll package them, and that rating on there will be 100%. In other words, they'll say it's 100 amp hour. Well, the internal cells actually would have to be greater than 100 amp hours for them to give you 100 amp hours, because Lithium iron phosphate chemistry is good for an 80% depth of discharge. So anyway, that's a big difference. Okay, so that gives you a lot more for, you know, a smaller, lighter package with more life cycles. You have more usable energy. And we're going to look at the power curves when we turn this over. This is also another thing that makes a huge difference in the performance between lead acid and lithium iron phosphate. Now, we're going to talk about different systems. Okay? 12 volt, 24, and 48 volts are the most common. And the difference, you know, why choose one over the other? Well, we're going to show you in a moment that if we used 4 100 amp hour batteries, depending on how we configure them, we'll show you some differences. But remember that volts times amps equals power. Okay? We talked about that in the last episode. That's the formula for power, volts times amps. So if we had a 1500 watt load, which is almost what the water heater was in the example in the last episode, I believe it was 1600 watts. But for this example, I chose 1500 watts, which is a pretty good load. But for instance, in my travel trailer, I have a 3000 watt inverter. So this is only half of what that inverter is capable of putting out. For this example, we're talking about you know, the current in this system based on the load. So remember, we're going to take, you know, the watts, and so the formula go in this direction. Current equals power over voltage. Okay, so 1500 watts at 12 volts, 1500 divided by 12, that gives us 125 amps in that setup. If we go with a 24 volt system, same load, 1500 watts, divided by 24 volts, gives us half the current, 62.5 amps. And at 48 volts, same load, 48 volts, we're only going to have 31.25 amps in that system. So that's, you know, a fourth of what we'd have at 12 volts. Well, big deal, huh? Well, let me show you the big deal. Here's the size of cable you need for that 12 volt setup. Here's the size of cable you would need for the 24 volt setup. That one's still on the spool here. And that's the size for 48 volts. Huge difference. Huge difference in weight, huge difference in cost, huge difference in the amount of room it takes up, the cost of the connectors, on and on and on. Huge difference in the amount of heat that's produced. But that's not it. That's just part of it. Guess what else? You're also going to have a 48 volt system is much more efficient than 12 or 24. The 48 volt system is going to be smaller in physical size than the others. And the cost is going to be less. So, I mean, pretty good argument. The cost, not just for the components, but for the wiring, huge difference between 10 gauge and double aught. Huge difference. So, those are some things to consider. Let's take a look at the power curves I was talking about, because it affects all of this also. We have here are the discharge curves for lead acid and lithium iron phosphate. Well, lead acid has a very linear discharge curve. So as that battery's discharging, the voltage drops in this nice straight line. But as it's discharged, matter of fact, it's so predictable that in the days of using the cars, what we used for a state of charge meter was actually a volt gauge that was just scaled to say state of charge, because we knew exactly at what voltage was what percent state of charge. Okay? It's a direct correlation. But I just want to show you the current change over this discharge curve. So between fully charged lead acid battery, I looked on the internet because I had discussions with people over this. There's so much misinformation on the internet, especially when it comes to batteries. Don't believe it. It's 2.2 volts per cell. A 12 volt lead acid battery has 6 cells in it. 6 times 2 is 13.2 volts fully charged. Now, I mentioned earlier that lead acid has fairly high internal resistance, and so that once it's off the charger and it's at rest, that voltage is going to drop and drop and drop and drop and drop and drop. So fully charged 13.2 volts. Typically you'll find a battery that's sitting in the wild, so to speak, that's been sitting there for days or weeks, to be somewhere between 13 and like maybe 12.8. When it gets to 12 volts, it's basically a dead battery. Okay, and if you take it below 10 volts, you're doing irreparable damage to that battery. Don't go there. But I just wanted to show you that, this discharge curve being so steep like this, that when you start out at 13 volts and you have a 1500 watt load that we've been discussing earlier, you're going to be pulling 115 amps. When you drop down to 12 volts, you'll be pulling 125 amps. And when you get down to 10 volts, you're pulling 150 amps. So you're maintaining the same load, but your current's going up as the voltage comes down because of that power voltage current relationship. Now, on the other hand, fully charged LiPo4 cells, most of the chargers should be designed to shut off around, some of them go up to 14.5 and so forth. What's best for those cells, and like I said, I've handled tens of thousands of these cells. What's best for them is 14 volts. So again, after you take it off that charger, it's going to slowly drop over time until it gets to its nominal voltage, which is 13.2 volts, which is the maximum voltage for the lead acid, okay, fully charged voltage. And then it has this very flat discharge curve. And it's not till the very end, you go past this knee, which is, again, I forget, I'm used to individual cell voltages, I can tell you that. But anyway, it gets down here and then it's going to drop real quick. And they have the internal BMSs in these things to make sure that you don't go below that 10 volts. But all this time you have this real flat discharge curve, which means you're going to have this nice flat rate of draw. The time given on these two systems, you're going to be able to pull a load longer using lithium. One, because of you can go out to 80% depth of discharge versus only 50% with the lead acid. Highly recommend this route. So next, let's talk about the configurations. So right here we've got a 12 volt configuration, 24 volt, and 48 volt. Now, what they all have in common is we're going to use 4 12 volt 100 amp hour cells for our example in comparison. So we have 4 12 volt 100 amp hour cells or batteries here in parallel. And when you have batteries in parallel, that means all the positives are connected together and all the negatives are connected together. And when you do that, the voltage stays the same, but your capacity increases. So that in parallel like this, that gives us 12 volts at 400 amp hours. Okay? And if we want to know how much total capacity that is, remember, volts times amps. So volts times amp hours gives us watt hours. So that's 4,800 watt hours or 4.8 kilowatt hours. Okay? That's a typical way to do it. Like I said, the downside to doing it this way is that your inverters and other components are going to cost more. You're going to have larger wire, larger connectors. You're going to have more heat, blah, blah, blah. Next example is a series parallel example. So we've got two in parallel, and then they're in series. And series is where you go from positive to negative, positive to negative, positive to negative. That's a series circuit. And in a series circuit, the voltage adds, but the capacity stays the same. So in this case, we have two in parallel. So that gives us 12 volts at 200 amp hours. And then here we have 12 volts at 200 amp hours, but they're in series. So it gives us a total of 24 volts, 200 amp hours. Again, volts times amps gives us that same 4,800 watt hours or 4.8 kilowatt hours. So same capacity, different layout. Again, smaller wire, less expensive components, more efficient when you come to your inverters and so forth. You can have greater efficiency, but you're going to pay, more, the same for the batteries. That part's not going to change, but the wiring's going to be cheaper and the other components will be cheaper. Okay, and last, this is the one I recommend. This is the one I would have in my own system had I not been reusing components I already owned, and the components I owned just happen to be 12 volts. Otherwise, this is what I recommend. This is the way I would have gone. You can see we have the same 12 volt, 100 amp hour cells, 4 of them still, and they're in series. So we go negative to positive, negative to positive, negative to positive. And this is our most negative, and this is our most positive. And that gives us 48 volts, 12 times 4, at 100 amp hours. And that still gives us 4,800 watt hours and 4.8 kilowatt hours. Okay? Now, one of the other things to consider in doing the layout is, can it handle the load? So one of the things that if we were only using, one battery, you couldn't do one 12 volt battery with a 1500 watt load, because it's going to pull more than most of these are able to deliver. Most of these are rated at a maximum output of 100 amps. And I'm talking the LiPo 4s. And so you would have to have at least 2 of them to handle that much load. But in this example with 4, we can handle a 3,000 watt inverter, which is easily going to handle the load in this example. Okay? So, just more things that, you can consider. But if we just, reduce it down to the, least confusing aspect is, one, we determined our power needs. That was the last episode. This one, we determined how much energy storage do we need. And I've done it subtly, so I'm going to do it bluntly now. You want X number of days. Okay? So if you had, in my case, where I had 5,000 watt hours of usage per day, you could see four batteries would be falling short. So I would want more than that. Or I would want larger, make these 200 amp hour batteries. And that would give me 2 days basically, if I was conservative. Okay? So you hopefully you get the gist of it here. So based on how much time you want to be able to go without being able to charge, that's what's going to dictate your battery pack size. So my battery pack size is a little over 16.5 kilowatt hours. And so based on that 5,000 or 6,000 per day, so say 15.5, that would be 3 days. But that's going all out. Very easily can conserve and get 7 days comfortably without sweating or freezing to death or whatever. There's ways that I can cut back easily, and one of them is don't shower every day, so you don't use the hot water every single day, that kind of thing. Which is my largest consumer. That was at 1,600 watt hours. So there's ways to conserve to get those days that you want. Now, in our next episode, we're going to talk about how to recharge this. Okay, we've got, a draw, and we can conserve it somewhat. There are some things that are, the amount of time you run the lights, the amount of time you run the heater, the amount of time you run the air conditioning, the high, amount of hot water I use, the high energy demand things. You can put some conservation measures in place and cut back on your consumption. But if you're starting from scratch and you have to make these purchases, you may want to think about what you're doing and why. So if you, for instance, went with a 48 volt system and you went with this, and you could get another 4 cells and or batteries and put those in parallel with these 4, and you still have a 48 volt system. You have all the benefits of that, and you double to 96 100 watt hours, and that big difference. And so next time we're going to look at what it's going to take based on the decisions we make, and decisions are going to be made by what our consumption is going to be and how long we want to be able to provide for that consumption, and how quickly we want to recoup that storage. So how many days of wind or solar or whatever that you're using do you need to have to recharge this? And that's what we're going to talk about next time. So I hope you enjoyed this. Hope you got something out of it. If you have any questions, leave them in the comments below. Otherwise, please subscribe, and I hope to see you next time.